thank you for coming. There are lots of new faces here tonight, so we will definitely try and recruit you once we've finished. But until then, I'm very happy to welcome Jesse Armstrong, who is a screenwriter, producer, and a word I've just learned, showrunner, which he's going to tell us all about. And he's a multi-award winner, as you may have already known. And he's been writing all sorts of sitcoms and dramas as well over the last 25 years, maybe a bit longer, as well as doing other things with his life, and we're going to hear all about that. Before we start, I'd just like to have a sense of how many people have actually seen some of the series Succession. Okay. Keep your hands up if you've actually seen all of Succession. Okay, so we've got some, there might be...
How do you feel about spoilers?
Alright, okay, so you can give a spoiler alert and then maybe just leave the room. Okay. Right, okay, fine. Okay, good. Okay, so I thought we could start this evening.
Right, you were much more sceptical about people's ability to get Succession in Belgium. I think you owe the audience an apology. She was like, it's very hard to get over here. I think people are not going to... It's hard to get...
No! But they obviously all have these sort of special VPN accounts. I don't know what
See
else
the lawyers
for.
at the door.
So, they all know the tricks of the trade.
I'm here to collect my residuals.
Right, okay, so, to kick us off this evening, Jesse, I thought we could start by getting a sense of what your journey has been like. So, where you started and how you started and how that, what did that look like right at the beginning of your whole TV film writing career? Or before then even?
Okay, well, in some ways everyone has you to blame because a lot of my work has been involved with thinking about politics and the media, and the person who got me into politics and then the media was you. Do you remember? You had Bridie, when I was coming out of university and had no idea what I would do, helped through a friend of a friend of a friend get me a job working for an MP, which sort of introduced me to the world of politics in a way which I'd never expected. I was keen to work in it, but I wouldn't have think I'd made it in without your help, so thank you. But unlike, I don't know, I think Bridie's probably pretty good at thinking about what people will be good at, but I wasn't good at politics. So I worked for a Labour MP. This was in '97 when the Conservative government, Thatcher and then Major, had been in for years and years. And it was just before Tony Blair and New Labour won in '97. And so I worked for an MP for a while as a researcher. I did as well as I could, but I wasn't very good at it. And it became clear to me that I should do something else. And where my career in TV started was working with somebody who I'd met at university, my co-writer of the sitcom that we wrote for years, Peep Show, Sam Bain. And he came from a family who were a bit more aware of the world of comedy writing and TV. His dad had been a director who directed a big British TV show, Upstairs, Downstairs, and famous British sitcom, Terry and June, very suburban, sort of middle-of-the-road sitcom that his mum was in anyway. So he knew about that world, and I guess we'd done a bit of creative writing at university, a course, but he was someone who introduced me to the idea of writing scripts for money, and for people who are thinking about it, younger people or not so young, who are thinking about the world of writing. The gatekeeper, certainly in the sort of Anglo-American sphere, is the agent. That's the way that you start to get paid for your work. Is to find an agent who can then give you a bit of a stamp of authority to get you through the gatekeepers. There's lots of other ways of doing it, but that was the way that seemed like the main way then, and still is now, though there's obviously multiple routes into the industry. Is that enough on origin story?
Yeah, then maybe like your first entry into the whole TV world and talk us through that sitcom era.
Yeah, I did a bunch of things. We wrote a lot for children's TV. I think anyone who is thinking about writing, anything you can do to get paid work is obviously a bonus, because you're developing your craft while also earning a living. And for me and Sam, that was a lot of children's TV in the UK, which was somewhere where you could, somewhat under the radar or without the glare of critics being horrible about you, you could learn to write half hours of comedy. Sometimes the critics will still be rude even about children's TV, but not so much as... So lots of children's TV, and then we wrote for some sketch shows. There was a Smack the Pony, a notable British sketch show with the all-women cast that we wrote a bit for. That was like the first sort of, I think that was a breakthrough, and it was the first sort of thing that I would be pleased to show my peers and people and go, look, we were on this show, which had a bit of credibility and was a good show. And then in about 2003, we got our chance to come up with our own show, which was this show, Peep Show, with a well-known British duo, David Mitchell and Robert Webb, a sitcom that we ran for a whole number of years, and was where we but where we got to sort of do the kind of comedy that I think we thought would be the kind of stuff we loved and wanted to do, and we were, very happy to do that for a bunch of years.
Has anyone seen Peep Show here? Oh, okay. Very, very well, done your homework. And then from there, how did it sort of, was it just sort of one job after another, the whole workflow just laid out in front of you? Or?
Yeah, the years of real anxiety were early on when we were like, I guess for the first 6 years, when sometimes Sam was working in a video shop, I was painting and decorating, I'd do other things to try and, there was a decent period when we weren't paid writers. Once that show came on, we had periods. It's quite a, as you know, everyone who knows it will know that it's shot in this weird way where you see what the characters see and you hear their thoughts, and it's quite off-putting to audiences, I think, initially. So it wasn't like a smash hit, even though we did lots of series. For the first 1, 2, 3 series, there was always a doubt about whether it would come back again, get recommissioned. So we didn't have that real security until a little way, but I've never had to go back to painting and decorating since Peep Show, which is probably good for the people with houses, because I wasn't politics and painting and decorating. Neither of them were my métier.
And then after the Peep Show period, then how did you get into sort of like was the sort of succession phase the next phase, or was there something in between?
Lots of people lots of us have sort of portfolio careers now, and especially in writing, it's quite usual to have a few things going along. And I wrote one of Charlie Brooker's Black Mirrors, and that was one of the first things I did on my own with a more dramatic tone. So there've been a few little projects which were like bridging things if you were thinking about the shape of someone's career, my career. But Succession, I'd had this feeling of, I thought there was... Do you want me to... Shall I talk about the origin story of that show?
Yeah, go ahead.
So quite a while before we made the show, 10 years before, I'd been asked to write a screenplay about the real Rupert Murdoch. Initially it was like quite a cheap format of a documentary format where an actor playing Rupert Murdoch gave his business secrets straight to camera, quite cheap. I couldn't write that, so I wrote a sort of TV play film about the family, but it was very hard to get made. It was quite an unusual form and maybe a bit heavy going and very Murdoch-y. So it went away. No, we could never get it made. But as Succession was coming to, as Peep Show was coming to an end, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, it was suggested to me you could do that show, but a fictional version. And I'd been reading a little bit about, I'd read Disney Wars, a very good book about the Disney Corporation, James Stewart, and I think I'd read a bit about Robert Maxwell, who was a big, media figure in the UK in the 1980s. Him and Murdoch owned the kind of rival to tabloid papers. Anyway, it struck me that, wow, this would be very liberating to be able to take these stories, not just from this one family and feeling quite restricted by the truth of them, but the commonalities between many of these, especially Anglo-American media owners, the Murdochs, the Mercers, the family-owned Comcast, who's all the research is already slipping away, but and also going back, to Hearst, who was the model for Orson Welles, so the commonalities, and indeed all the succession stories that there are, through history. It's once you start thinking about succession, you quickly find yourself thinking about kings and queens, and obviously the British royal family and all the other royal families and emperors, and once you think, oh wow, if we're doing a succession story, I can steal from King Lear and from Henry IV and Henry V and Henry VI, and then it's quite exciting the amount of theft you can do and how little work you're going to have to do as a writer, because all the stories are a legion. And so I went to the US and I fancied the idea of doing a show with some scope and with a bigger budget, and so pitched it around in America, and the pitch at that time was Dallas meets Feston, the Dogma movie from. So it'd have that like vivid rich people thing, but shot in that Dogma handheld, like you're getting a peek behind the curtain and to see what these people are really like, and some of the dysfunction as well of that Thomas Vinterberg film. So and HBO said yes, but particularly, I mean, I'd done a lot of TV by that point, but they also said yes because Adam McKay, who recently directed Don't Look Up, about environmental satire, but he'd done Anchorman, and he'd just done very well with the movie about the financial crisis. Big Short, thank you. So when he agreed to be the director, I think the idea of a somewhat or extremely untested British showrunner was more appealing, so they had the comfort of knowing, well, if he fucks it up, this director will probably save him.
So then, so tell us then, what was your sort of day to day? How did the whole thing, from that moment when you pitched it and you got the job and you got the part and you got then what happened? Where did it go? Sorry to drag you through the.
Oh no, I'm interested in it. The last answer was a mammoth one. That feels like this one's going to be about half an hour.
Go ahead.
What's most interesting to you and to people about? I guess you hear the role showrunner and think about what. I did so many things on the show. I guess I'm intrigued what you imagine, and then I can maybe set you right. Okay. Is that a useful way?
It is.
Or I can try and say it, but it's.
Okay, but just sort of say kind of about you basically you come out of the UK and then you just end up in Hollywood, right? And then you're there going, I've got my Dallas and Dallas Feston version here on the table, right? Okay, and then they go, right, go on, get on with it. So then you're in that writing phase. Where are you, and physically what?
So you write the pilot. I wrote the pilot on my own, the first script, and that's like in a way the Bible of the show. It sets the tone, which is so important for any piece of work, but especially a TV show. Then we made the pilot, and then that's a big decision point. Should we make a series or not? And they said yes. And then and obviously you do the casting, which was anyone who has enjoyed the show. The cast are an extraordinary group of people who were lucky to get together, and it was nice to have them less well known. So I think as viewers, you get a bit more of a direct relationship, and you're not thinking about, oh, that's Meryl Streep and the 16 other things she's done. Probably more than 16 for Meryl Streep, yeah, would you say that? So you do the casting, make the pilot, and then you go, if you're lucky, you go to series. And then a really great part of the process for me begins, which is the writing room. So you assemble a writing staff, some of whom were known to me and lots weren't, and you plot out the first series, and that's a very enjoyable part of the process for me. And in a way, I'd always worked in a writer's room. It'd just been me and Sam, 2 people, and the dynamic isn't that much different. It's just there were like 8 people, and you get a chance to have many different experiences and types of people in the room. And so especially writing a family ensemble show like this, it's great to have a bunch of different perspectives, and it's also great to, you know, the hardest thing to do, in my opinion, in a TV show is get the plot right. Once you've got the tone, the hardest thing is getting the tone, and once you've got that, making sure that each episode will be a satisfying story takes a lot of work, even those stories that when you watch them as a viewer feel like, not such a good one this week. I can pretty much guarantee that the writers would have, you know, sweated bullets to get to that. Oh, they lost the ticket, then they went to the party and they found it, and then that's the end. Like to make a really satisfying story, which we tried to do, didn't always succeed, but tried to do is the hardest thing. And to cycle through the ideas with a group of intelligent, funny people makes it that quite tough process much easier. Still tough, but much easier.
So I'm sure other people will want to grill you about these moments later. I mean, going to like granular.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So then you're in the writers' room and you produce and then the showrunner is on the set, it's with the actors, it's choosing the actors, it's directing them. How does that work?
Yeah, I guess when you were sort of saying what is it, I guess the one analogous role is the director in a film, and you know they say that film is a director's medium, and the auteur theory, which you know we can discuss, but the figure who everyone looks at on a film set is the director, and the figure that people still look at the director on the TV set, and they're very important, and I've been lucky to have some really brilliant collaborators, but you, as the showrunner, you're there. I wrote the pilot, and I'm there from the very last day of the edit, and that you have that continuity of involvement, which one of the good things about it, I think, is lots of people here have watched the show, and we really wanted the show to be worthy of an audience's close attention. And I think that if you don't have a writer around a lot through a show, there can be a temptation on the writer's behalf to, in the script, to overly nail everything, make it too clear, make sure that piece of information is absolutely conveyed to the audience because it's important and what I want to say or what I think is an important thing to communicate. If you know that you're helping choose the actor and you're going to be there through every redrafting of the script, and you're going to be on set watching them film it, and then you're going to be in the edit also to see which take you use and from what angle and what little reaction you get from the person watching them, you can be much more subtle, because we all spend our whole lives observing other people, right, and wondering what they're thinking, interpreting their thoughts. And I think a good TV show can mimic some of that experience, and that's what I enjoy, is watching something where I'm offered enough information that the story, the mystery of these other people seems soluble, but not offered up on a plate, so there's nothing left for me to do. And being a so-called showrunner lets you be there all the way through the process, and maybe you don't need all those words you thought were important, and you can do it with a look, and then it's very enjoyable for the audience to speculate to themselves on what exactly it means. And I think it's important that there's an answer, that me and my fellow writers and directors and actors know the answer, but it's not important that everyone has the same answer in the audience.
Very cryptic.
Little cryptic.
And just out of interest, did you ever sit and watch your shows in a public place while everyone else was viewing? Did you sit at the back of the pub?
I've had screening events where I've watched it with an audience, and it's very pleasurable because you don't get to do that normally with TV. You do for films and sitcoms that might get filmed in front of a TV audience, but it's very nice to watch it, especially if it's got comedic beats and you can hear people responding. It's a lovely feeling.
But that's an invited audience.
Yeah, but normally, they don't. The show had some success, but I wouldn't have liked to put it on at a British pub at 10 o'clock and said, "Okay, everyone, let's watch some satire."
After the football. Change channel. Right. Okay. So I thought.
While we're on British pubs, I am very aware we're here in Brussels and we're entirely in English, and I'm sorry that we're not in a bilingual situation, and so thank you for putting up with my lack of linguistic facility. Just seems a bit rude not to mention.
I think I suffer from the same, handicap. Okay, so I think there's another part that I want to go to with this conversation, but I think if anyone has any sort of specific succession-related questions or dramatic, creativity questions, I think now is the time, and then we'll pick up again together. So I'm going to race around the room, right? This is the point where you see how, right, I'm going to come here first, and I'll go over there. Right, go on.
Bride, are you going all Oprah?
Who's your favourite character to write about?
I can't possibly answer that. It'd be so rude. Can you imagine if I said? I guess I always did quite like the characters of Tom and Greg, who are the sort of outsiders, because it's not my world and they're looking in. There's something about writing them, but you also have, when you're writing every scene, you have to want to be in every perspective. It's no good. I think that leads to a weak show if you're like, oh, I love writing Tom, but like Shiv, yeah, she just says some stuff. You've got to be like, when you're writing Shiv, you need to feel her point of view, fill you as much as her scene partner.
Hi Jesse, I'm a very big fan, and Succession I think is probably one of the best shows ever.
Oh.
I'm sure you have more accolades than that, but if we're sticking to Succession questions, what did Kendall do? What happens to him?
Well, so we're going to do this without spoilers, but so what happens to him at the end?
What does he do in your mind? Because Kendall, obviously, I understand the Succession was good where it ended, but it left a lot of questions. Yeah,
and honestly, I really do. I mean, I could speculate for kind of fun, but the boring the boring answer is that, well, as a sort of showrunner and writer, my interest in, not in a horrible way, but like my interest in him had to sort of end there. Like this was a story about succession. We won't do the spoilers, but there is a succession, and in a way, if I had been interested in what happened to him next, we would have written it and we would have done it. But the story is not an endless spooling out of just like, here's some rich people and let's watch them as they fuck around and screw each other over and then on to the next thing. It had a sort of a coherent idea that was there for me and I think the other writers. So I could say I literally don't know what he did. I don't know. That's my real answer. I don't know.
My final question, and then a more serious question. In terms of script writing for the actors, because Succession, the actors, they couldn't play their roles better. How much was your script writing in them as opposed to themselves in their own acting? Did you write it most of it before having them in mind, and then you cast them, or they were cast?
So I think I get it. The pilot is technically and in fact written before you cast. So you cast with that thing, with the exception of Brian Cox, who I think we'd approached before. No, we hadn't. So it was written without knowing who any of the actors would be. However, once they're cast, you start writing towards people's inflections and abilities and wants, and sometimes not wants, stuff that will be challenging but that they can achieve. So there's a real great dialogue between their abilities and your ambitions for them. But my goodness, I never would have known that someone like Kieran Culkin, who came in and did a read on tape, being taped, liked by Julius at the back, and sometimes as a writer you get somebody who inhabits your words in a way which feels almost occult, because it's like, wow, did I just summon up some sprite who's able to like do this horrible stuff? And it's very thrilling when you see someone do stuff you've written in a way which feels both completely natural and also a little bit surprising, that you're like, I didn't know that was in there. So it's a very thrilling part of the process when it works.
Right, we've got one here.
first of all, thank you so much for bringing so much joy to so many people. You know, I grew up on a diet of Peep Show and don't regret it for a second. Succession was also a phenomenal show, is also a phenomenal show. And I just wanted to ask, you mentioned Orson Welles and Citizen Kane. Hearst, in the aftermath, spent many years chasing down Orson and trying to sort of run him out of town. Has there been any sort of response from the Murdoch dynasty?
No, when I was putting this show together, I was reassured is not the right word, but assured perhaps by someone that Rupert Murdoch was not litigious but vindictive. So that wasn't terribly reassuring, but there hasn't. And I think part of the reason, you know, there is obviously, right, with Fox News, which is the closest analogue of the TV news station that we have in our show, some of the parallels between the shape of that family, that seems like can be quite a neat mapping. It's also not that neat. Occasionally I ask people, like, which one do you think is Lachlan and which one is James? And we're not mapped onto that family directly. And also, although I got strong feelings about how media ownership works, you know, I think Wells, you know, there are things like the alleged origin of Rosebud, that he was quite nasty in his, and there can be a place for nastiness. He went for Hearst in a way which our show has never. I feel very interested in and concerned about the power that Murdoch has had in the US and in the UK and Australia. The show doesn't deal in the kind of nasty, personalised, gossipy, mapping, Roman à clay kind of things. It really is as much, you know, I think in Brian Cox's performance, people who know Maxwell from the UK will see probably more of Maxwell in Cox's performance than Murdoch, and certainly Sumner Redstone, who changed his will 40 times, I think, in the run-up to his death, is in some ways more of a parallel to how Logan treats his kids. That Murdochs have had their ups and downs, but they're in some ways a relatively coherent family. So yeah, we haven't had that long answer.
Yeah, just a question here. Again, thank you very much. Wonderful show. Just more a question about process as far as the writer's room is concerned. So you mentioned that you would sort of discuss each episode, but I'd like to know sort of did each writer have more of one character as their point of focus, or was it very much a discussion right from the beginning of this is the episode we want to do, we know the basic storyline, and how will we evolve it throughout the show?
Yeah, the way that we do our room is certain writers have certain proclivities and affections and feel protective about certain storylines or characters, but in general, or a bit like I said about having to inhabit every character, everyone needs to be able to think of a story for everyone, and you're thinking of the whole thing as an organic thing. It can't be a kind of orchestra where someone's playing the Roman trombone and then someone comes in with the other characters. You have to do it organically and think about the piece altogether. So we'd write the season overall. We'd kind of break, as we say, roughly the episodes so that we sort of knew roughly what scenes there would be in it on cards, and that we'd do that all together. And then writers would go off and I would go off and I'd write a bunch of episodes, and some of my fellow writers would write their episodes, and then the drafts would come in and I'd help them look at them, and we'd work on them.
Thank you. I'm such a big fan of the show. It's really great to be here. I wanted to know, did you already know how things were going to end in the last season? So had you already mapped out from the beginning what's going to happen, or did that come as you went along?
At the very beginning, not at all. At the very beginning, I even thought that Logan might die at the end of the first episode, And then when we saw the first episode, we thought, oh, no, we better keep this guy around. He's quite good. And then we thought maybe he'd die at the end of the first season. But then as we were doing the first season, we thought, oh no, well, let's keep him around. By the time when we're making the last season, so in the room, it's all been discussed, and we know exactly pretty much exactly what's going to happen through that season. So the writer's room decides the whole season, and then we write it and then film it. So it's all decided for the 10 episodes then. But I didn't know where it would go, but I did know the tone of the ending. So even though that's sort of, it's kind of a joke about the Logan character, but it's also true. I did consider him dying at different times, but I guess what I knew was that the tone of this piece wasn't going to be a triumphant succession, and it wasn't that from what I'd seen of these families, it's very rare for the business, quote, genius of one of these figures to be passed down to one of their family, and usually successions are messy and complicated, bloody, and result in a child king or queen with overmighty advisors and lots of bloodshed. So I knew that the tone of it, and also having looked, Bridie was asking and chatting, we were chatting a little bit about how much research there is in the show, and there was a lot of that deep research about families, but also I encouraged my fellow writers, and I myself just read a lot of, especially Financial Times and Wall Street Journal, to make sure we knew what was happening in business. And most of the seasons are structured around the big moves you can see as traditional media power ebbs, and there's these consolidations of media companies in the face of tech coming. So that was very important to get to be the tone of the show, but not the details.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I admit I'm guilty. I haven't watched Succession yet, but I definitely will. I'm planning to. I was interested in your creative process, your personal one. Before the hype and all the success, how did you handle self-doubt, if any, if you have any, of course? How did you handle this phase?
It's a good question for any writers in the room or people who think about it, because I don't know a single writer, certainly not a good one, who doesn't wrestle with imposter syndrome, feeling of like, even if they've written something they quite like before, the new thing always feels like the moment at which your talent will be found out and found wanting. And so self-doubt is, I did this event on the weekend with, I did the Bridie's role for Greta Gerwig at the BFI, and she had a good phrase about like the gold being, the good writing being the gold, and it's guarded by a dragon, and that's because it's valuable stuff, so it's hard to get. And I think there's something in that, right, that it's hard to get to this good stuff, and there's lots of things stopping us, and probably the biggest one is the dragon of self-doubt and too much self-criticism. Something I sometimes say when I'm doing a little talk with younger writers is like, try and be easy on yourself at the start and hard at the end, because it's really easy to write that first page, think, oh God, this isn't as subtle and wonderful and clever and brilliant as I thought it would be, and put it away and think, oh, tomorrow I'll get it. But if you can keep on going and keep on going, there's something in there, and you can redraft it. Once you've got something, you can work on it, and work on it. And then there can be a tendency, once you've finally got your script and you feel so relieved to have finished it, to hit send and send it to a friend or an agent or a contact. And that's when you probably need to put it away in a drawer for a few days and let that high pass, and come back to it and work on it some more and some more.
Yeah, also a huge fan, great to have you here. I was interested when you were talking about the genesis of Succession. It sounded, might be wrong, that this was the first time you'd really kind of worked in Hollywood. And then I was wondering about the writer's room, precisely because it is quite, as you described, the Anglo-American media business, and whether the organisation of the writer's room reflected that in order to deal with the fact that some of the characters were British, some American, and how you manage that as a writing team.
Yeah, I think that's true. We always did the room in London. I felt that was quite important. I felt, it is a sort of American, although it's set in New York, sort of LA, Hollywood, the money comes from Hollywood, from HBO. But I think it was good for us that we had a bit of distance and we were working not in amongst the buildings that our characters inhabit, and had, certainly for a satirical show, having a distance is very useful. And in terms of the second part of your question, is about
the writing room and whether.
Oh yeah, and the writing room, yeah, and that was very important. We had consultants. We had Marissa Marr who was from the Wall Street Journal as a business consultant who was on the show all the way through. We had a number of producers who were American who would keep an eye. I did American studies and I've spent some time in the US, but that kind of academic knowledge is no substitute for being in the culture. So I tried for the room to be about half men, half women, and about half Americans and half British people, so that we had those different perspectives. And I think that was very important because you can't sort of add that stuff in afterwards, and it was important to have those Americans in the room. Although I think it would be very hard for that room to write a show about, The Bear, which is a show set in Chicago in a restaurant, kind of blue collar neighborhood, right? The world of these kind of rich people is a bit more international. That show we can easily have an episode in London, we could have one in Dubai, we could be in Brussels or Paris or Rome. They are an international family and their vocabulary is quite international, so we were always saved by that as well.
Thank you. I hate the show.
Finally.
I had so much gush. Sorry, I'm trying to prove it's a huge fan. I'm interested when HBO signed you on or signed on for this. Did they sign on for the full 4 seasons? And if they didn't, how did you establish the narrative arc if you're not quite sure how long the whole story will take? And if they did sign on for 4 seasons, did you ever think, especially at the beginning, oh my God, I've got 40 episodes, how the hell am I going to fill 40 episodes?
Yeah, so luckily or unluckily, no, they don't give you any promise, and you write sort of running towards the cliff edge and hoping that you'll come back. And if had we not, I don't know how that season would exist in an odd world where it just ended. They were generous, even though it didn't do amazingly with audiences. They did recommission it while it was on air through the first one. So they're a good, I've had good collaborative experience there, and I think they're a good group of people, and they did give us a chance to go again, even though it was well regarded by critics, not universally, and so it was a certain amount of bravery in their decision to do another one.
Hi, big fan of the show. As a journalist, I really love sort of your portrayal of the media and how the sausage is made in real life. Also as a journalist, I hear lots of amazing stories and things, and can only write half of what I hear, frankly, or run the risk of libel issues, etc. But I have been flirting with this idea of turning one particular story that I couldn't really publish properly into a fictionalized version. Given that you sort of moved from looking at the Murdochs and then did a fictional version of the family, of a sort of type of family.
Sure.
How do you get away from getting stuck in the weeds of fact? Because there's a lot of colorful characters already in real life in the story, I know. Mm-hmm. But I'm sort of, I don't know how to sort of move from, I'm too attached to the real facts and real people. How do you fictionalize it?
I guess
and then how do you get away with, if you want to make it similar to the real story, how do you get away with it legally? How?
The second part sounds like if there are any lawyers in the room. There are versions of stories, right, which are very close to real events, and Hollywood often does that, and even takes real events and changes stuff. I'm not an expert in that kind of dodging the line kind of thing. I think there's a moral question too. If you're doing that stuff, if you are really portraying real people, I don't know what your story is. Maybe there aren't moral considerations with these people. But I guess I would, so there's a version where you do your story and you legal it and you do your thing, and it sounds like you might be a little bit attracted to the very hard facts, and sometimes that's the story you want to tell, that story. If you're going to do the other version, you need to find what's universal in there. Like if it's a corruption story, or a personal corruption, or financial corruption, or a moral corruption, what's the bit of that which is interesting to you, which feels like the heart of it? Because I bet you could, if it's a pharmaceutical story, it could probably work in the oil world, or you know what I mean. If you've got a relationship to the heart of the story, then the specifics can start to drop away. And if they don't start to drop away, you've probably got one of those second stories which is so specific about, you know, this particular mine and that particular regulation and that particular person on that particular day. And then I think you've got to bite the bullet and say, okay, what I'm trying to do is the story of this event, and then that's where it gets its power from its closeness to reality. Not helpful? Or there's a computer program you can put it through, and AI will just change all the names for you.
Just a follow-on question from what you just said. How much of the series was really based on factual events that took place? The second question I was going to ask you was in terms of your research process. Did you ever come across another Australian who was an even more appalling character, Kerry Packer?
Yeah. Yeah, Kerry Packer, Tiny Roland. There's endless of these sort of all men, all these figures who are pretty disastrous for their families. But Kerry Packer's taken up my imagination. I've forgotten the first part of the question.
The first one is about how much of the events that took place in some events were based on real life.
What's a lot. It's a starting place for a lot of it. Sometimes just also you get a lot from in the room of people coming in saying, I went and had supper last night with my dad, and their dad is not a media mogul, but he is a bit of a bastard, and you take something from that part of life and go, wow, what if that happened in a media magna world? And then often you can take a big deal which is happening, and that's a great starting point, or a detail within the deal. Often it's the details which are really telling. And then usually what's useful in the story is not actually how that played out, but how it would play out in your world. And something that was very common, I'm going to start, I bet I'll forget the names, but this audience might be better than me. The Toyota Renault CEO. Goen, everyone probably knows, knows this story, that it's complicated international corporate or international politics, but he found himself in Japan in custody, feeling that he was going to be convicted, and he escaped the jurisdiction in, I think, like a music box or a guitar box. Was it a guitar box? Yeah. Big guitar. Guitar case. Right. So amazing story. When we talk about it in the room, all our heads light up like, that really happen to a CEO, a man of such wealth and privilege, and there he is climbing into it. Wow. And we try and stitch it into a story and think, well, how could this happen? And we had, guess what, our corporate figures had been involved in a scandal, because as we researched, there were lots of scandals, and it seemed like this would fit. He's in trouble as well. But as we tried to write it or thought about that story, what we had to do was just make it 20 times more boring, because if we'd had our Logan Roy climbing into a music box and smuggled out in the dead of night and flown to Lebanon, I think this audience would have been going, yeah, that's kind of where the show lost me, actually. That would never happen. It just would never happen. So oftentimes you have to take, and yet we do, not without spoilers, we have one very vivid thing that happens at the end of the first series, a really tragic event, involving loss of life. So you need to have some of that stuff, but you have to be very careful when you use real life, because oftentimes it's too good or vivid to live in your world.
Was there any truth in what you just spoke about at the end of season 1? Was there any truth in that related to the Murdochs?
Oh God, no, not as far as I'm aware. No, that was very much stolen from Teddy Kennedy and Chappaquiddick in rather maybe too direct a way, but that's what the sort of event that we were after.
Hi there. when you were describing your research and looking at historical figures, it sounded a bit like how the Game of Thrones people were describing their work process and drawing on historical events. Can you elaborate a bit on that and how you wove some of these Shakespearean type stories into your drama?
Yeah, I'd like to pretend I'm super erudite, and I was picking a little bit of, Augustan history and a little bit of medieval. I know some history, and we did have an ancient historian come and talk to us in the room, and I know a little bit of classical history and a bit of British history. But I can't. It wasn't. I think that for Game of Thrones, they very much used Anglo-Saxon history, right, as their touchstone, and I think George R.R. Martin and the writers used that. We didn't have anything like that. It was more a case of pick and mix and shards of reading and little relationships and in that British way, a lot of it not proper history but refracted through Shakespeare's version of things. Kind of the show obviously feels that there's a bit of King Lear in there. It's not. You don't have to be I'm not a King Lear or Shakespeare scholar, but you that's in there, and there are other elements which are taken. But we didn't have one model, but it was more like what did you see on TV last night than rigorously going through Edward Gibbon and mapping it on or anything.
So I have a question, not about the writing, and also bear with me because English is not my first language, but what fascinated me in Succession and all through the 4 seasons were actually, first of all, the costuming, the fashion that the characters were wearing, and also the music, that amazing score that Brittelle wrote for the show. And it's still quite, basically season 4 ended and basically everyone started to dress like shit. It was like in that quite luxury trend, and it was basically Succession. And so I was wondering, as a writer, how do you communicate that like Succession vibe through things that are not written but kind of non-verbal, like music and fashion and such?
It's good questions, because it's me talking, I've emphasised my own role a lot, naturally, maybe, but it's worth saying about the collaboration. The writers' room is incredibly important. I worked with some really extraordinarily talented writers, and as a showrunner, I do have a huge amount of opportunity to influence and change things to my taste, but also there's areas like costume, and in particular Nick Brittelle, who he'd worked on The Big Short, and so Adam McKay said, why don't you get Nick to do the music? And I went to his flat and he played me some pieces, including the theme tune, and the top of my head blew off, because it was a bit like that fortunate thing of seeing Kieran acting. It immediately felt like this kind of wonky grandeur, sort of slightly hip-hop infused, New Yorky feeling, sort of corrupt but baroque, and it was just perfect. And I think that I just think the show would be a lot worse if it didn't have that theme tune introducing you every week, that sort of feeling, and also the score that he put all the way through it. And I have no creative involvement with whatsoever. That's just an incredibly happy collaboration and a brilliant. All I have to do is stand back and say, Nick, please, can we have more of that brilliant music? And in a way, similar costumes. Another showrunner has very strong feelings in the way that some people write in their scripts very precise costume descriptions, and they mean a lot to them. And I'm a little bit more he's a businessman, and yeah, she looks like a rich woman in New York, and so my notes would tend to be just like occasionally like, oh, they don't look quite rich enough, or is that what they would really wear to the costume department? And they would be like, yes, well, that's what they would wear, you know, this is our job. We spend quite a lot of time thinking about it. And so that's another one where you'd get back, I'd step back and let them do their brilliant work. And that's a great joy of working on a show with a big budget like this, is everywhere you look are people who don't really need your help. If you want to get out of their way, they will give you amazing work. And if you do want to collaborate and say, oh, what about this, then they're available. But yeah, I wish that Michelle Matland and her team were here to talk about Shiv's look, but I'm not going to be able to give you very good answers.
Hi Jesse, so first of all, thank you so much for being here this evening and for sharing all these insights with us. It's great to have you here. I'm really curious about your experience of writing in public, because I guess once you had the first pilot and it was Jesse Armstrong, creator, and suddenly you're writing in public and you're dealing with the forensic nature of fans on the internet. So I'm sort of curious about that, because you hear other writers and other artists talk about the gap between you putting something out in the world and then what is actually received by the audience in its various dimensions. So what I've kind of got two slight questions on that. So the first thing is there something that you put in, I'm not going to go too late in the series, so we're going to say, maybe stick to the first series, but is there something that you put in that you thought was a detail that the audience would really pick up on, that they totally missed, or really underappreciated, that you sort of wish that got a little bit more daylight? And then, obviously, the inverse as well. Do you think that, is there anything that you think was wildly misinterpreted, but you actually at some stage had to go back to the writer's room and go, that's actually quite a good idea?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and one that writers are probably reluctant to talk about in public, but talk about to each other in private about, you know, the world of the public reception, social media, the critics, the public as critics. It's part of our world now, and the pressure you can see on certain shows, showrunners, cultural stuff. There becomes this very, sometimes it can be delightful and it can be completely toxic, I think, depending for both parties, probably the fandom and the creatives. Luckily, in some ways, our show was, although I'm really gratified everyone's come to see us have a chat today. It's lovely to feel that there's people all around the world enjoying the show, but it's not a Game of Thrones or a Taylor Swift album where it's like, you know, there's this feeling of people descending on it in that ravenous way. So we never quite had that. We're saying maybe a little bit, but people were keen on the show, and they had theories. I tried to keep a distance from that while we were doing the show, and I pretty much did. It's difficult because it's seductive, because you do all this work and then you're curious what people think, and there are a lot of really intelligent viewers of the show. So it is you want to hear that people enjoy it and they're getting it. But I tried not to look at that sort of stuff too much. Another great thing about the writer's room is that if you're on your own, I think you start maybe having a conversation with the world about your work, and I think that might send you completely potty because the world is big and you are small. So, but the writer's room, I think, let us have a bubble. You know, they're very clever, intelligent. That's the same word. So they're both clever and intelligent, and kind and thoughtful people, and having that bubble where we felt like we were in command of the show, let you sort of detoxify anything that felt a bit overwrought, let you have quite an intellectual sometimes discussion about what the show meant, if there was anything we wanted to communicate, or in particular if we didn't want to communicate something, and therefore we were able to have those conversations in a so-called safe space without it curdling our brains, so that you start, I've occasionally heard of people writing TV shows where they are trying not to do what the fandom wants them to do. I think at that point you're fucked, right? Because you're like, you're trying to get ahead of everyone and do the opposite. Like, no, if the story, if you know, somebody needs to die and that's where the story's going, or if that's the deal is going to go through, then the deal's going to go through, and there'll be interesting things to say about that. Don't try and throw people off. It's just I think a crazy game.
Hi, Jesse. I have to confess I'm one of the few people in the room who hasn't seen Succession, but I'm kind of traditionally about 5 years behind everyone. So it's definitely on my list. But I'll be the guy here asking you about Peep Show, because I think it's one of the funniest shows that's ever been on television. It's hardly a week goes by when I'm not quoting Super Hands or something. That probably says a lot about me. But I wanted to ask you about the writing of that, because I think it must have been really interesting for a comedy, a very funny comedy. It went to a lot of really, really dark places. And how do you keep, I mean, these two characters, obviously, I had seen it written in, I think it was in the New Yorker, it mentioned your original pitch of that show was Beavis and Butthead, but live action. But it obviously evolved well beyond that. But how did you write these characters, keep them somewhat likable or relatable, or maybe you didn't want to do that, but go to, you know, get past an episode where they, you know, eat a dog, for example.
You're not getting us any. Let's get them in. Don't tell them about that. Sorry, that's late in the season.
How did you do that? How did you?
Yeah, I did. One thing I did. Succession has sometimes been criticised for not having anyone you can quote root for, and I think it is a thing that makes it resistible to some audiences. Luckily, HBO, we got enough people watching it that they didn't mind, and I resisted that temptation. I also, I might have a part of me missing, but I mean, I don't like the characters, and I think they do bad things, and they certainly do bad things to the world, but I don't look down on them in this morally, or in the sense that if I had the lives they had, I don't necessarily think I would act any better. I think they're a product of their, you know, familial and cultural inheritance. And with that in mind, you start to, I think, approach them with a certain amount of, well, there's, you know, it's a satire, and I think there's a certain amount of moral judgment, but there is not an absolute moral judgment that they are inherently bad people. Seem to got into moral philosophy when you were asking about dog eating, but but yeah. So I've never cared that much about making people likable. I feel like I know lots of people and I like lots of them, and they don't all have to be, you know, straightforwardly, uncomplicatedly, thoroughly decent. If anyone has friends like that, put their hands up. But in terms of how we kept on making it odd, one thing that just occurred to me, it's not the only thing, it's like work of just me and Sam talking to each other. Sam, but in the inception of the show, Sam still does meditation and has interest in Buddhism, but at the time he was very interested in Buddhism, and he'd been on a number of silent retreats. And one of the things that he was interested was going on a week's silent retreat, the very, very weird things he found himself thinking about. And I guess we always thought, like, if we could just put a little bit of how odd people's private thoughts are in, then that could be really interesting and very funny.
I was about to say leading on from that, but now I'm not sure I want to continue on a weird private thoughts moment, right? Moving on from Succession, many of you who are full circlers or normal, you know, in our midst, do spend some of your time thinking about, you know, the way of the world, where it's all going, and what our role is. And so I thought, just a quick show of hands, how many of you are either involved in writing or creative or TV, film work? Right, to just give you a sense of it. Okay, and how many of you might be involved in something which is sort of, you could say, you could also put your hand up for this one, something which is sort of thinking about kind of world changing, or being involved in the running and the operating of the places that we live and work in. All right, okay. So,
Policy wonks.
You've done TV for them too, I know. Or for us, yeah. So I think there's another interesting thing to find out from you about your experience in this world, especially with your very kind of like your hairline experience in the whole political process as well. But you know, you spent some time in the midst of a very important industry, and the industry has a role in what the world thinks and how the world behaves and how the world votes, and the people that you talk about or write about, also they themselves, and you've studied, are also ones that have, you know, an enormous amount of power and influence. So having spent those last years sort of immersed in this, can you just tell us a bit about what you think about it all, and the political environment and the media environment and the weight, or the, you know, the, sorry, it's quite a heavy loaded question after this.
No, I mean, I guess that in a way that's what the show is. It's in one of the ways of thinking about the show is it's a response, and it's a, you know, it's a great privilege to get to talk back to the culture. I mean, we all get to talk back a little bit, but to have such a big megaphone to talk back to the culture that is, especially the media, and especially the news media environment that was pervading the Anglo-American, Australian sort of public sphere. So we had some more and less direct things probably to say about that within the scope of the show, and it is a great sort of opportunity and sort of honour to get that opportunity, but it feels like it'd be easy to be reductive about what the show was saying. Otherwise, we shouldn't have done 40 hours.
And in terms, So in terms of the sort of the media scene and the Hollywood scene and the characters involved and the dynamics and the, you know, there is the whole Me Too, and we on this side of the Atlantic, you know, we see like movements and change and things, or you know, happening, and they like waves. Did you feel any of that? Is there any of that was a part of, like, were you aware of any of these sort of new ways of doing things or changes in the industry, even though you hadn't been in that bit for a very long time? Do that?
In the bit of politics.
Yeah, and the politics, and also in being in Hollywood and being amongst all of these writers and filmmakers and.
Yeah, I mean, yes, like especially when you mentioned Me Too, it was a sort of, it was something of a, you know, it was a watershed in the American TV and film world. We weren't in real. I've very rarely been in Hollywood. We write the show in quite a bubble in London, and then we shoot it in New York. And I don't think I've met a single other showrunner or director while I was doing it, because we were just doing the show. But are we part of the show? Is also, as well as being many other things, it's like a small corporation. It's like 200, 300 people making the show, and we're part of American society. And yeah, so Me Too, Black Lives Matter happened while we were making the show, and those are just electric change moments or opportunities for change, or events in a culture, and we're part of that culture. I'm British, but the show is very American, so yeah.
And the other thing that we always ask ourselves when we do our events here is what can we do in our lives that makes, as well as doing the thing that we really want to be doing, what is it that we can do that actually makes a difference? And it's a very mean question, because you have probably so much more perceived power than we do or might do in terms of, you know, your audience and but is that something that comes to you, or do you totally separate that out from your whole creative process?
It's a fascinating question, and I think it's really interesting when you say, and I wouldn't diminish the amount of like opportunity for influence or diminish my role or I think you should be able to stand behind everything you do in your show and what you say, its values. But it's a very interesting question, who has more power, somebody who's directly, I would say somebody who's directly related to policy making and policy implementation. That's how things happen, right? Directly and in a way that's comprehensible. It's certainly a different kind of power, and maybe over time well, it's very, very hard to quantify, but it has a different nature, the nature that a TV show's atmosphere, tone, I was going to say message, but I'm resistant to feeling like a TV show should have a message, because that feels like it's a piece of propaganda, and if it's a piece of propaganda, you might be for it or against it, but I don't think a bunch of people would turn up to hear how you made a piece of propaganda, right? It doesn't have the quality of humanity that makes us interested in engaging with it. The nature of the power of a TV show is quite a complicated one. I don't think it's not none, but nor is it very direct. And if it tries to be very direct, I think you're at the risk of not interesting your audience.
See, they've already switched off. Even the question.
I don't think so.
But life, does have a habit of imitating art, so, it will play itself out. Maybe you could just also give us a quick overview of the whole Writers Guild strike and what's going on, and what's the outlook and the upshot for the industry?
Two big ones. I think we were all, and people who were in the WGA, which I am, were all on strike for a good portion of the last year, and it seems like it's come to a good end from the point of view of the WGA. A lot of things that are not important, they're just union things that people would fight for better pay and certain amount of conditions, and then the ones which maybe have a bit more cultural interest about AI, which I think they did a great, as much protection as you can give against a force of life, which is you'd be foolish if you tried to anticipate exactly how it's going to develop, which is why it's so hard to do a deal on, probably, and why the studios were so resistant. So I think it was a great piece of union action, and being a bit in the US, it's such a curious society with these heavily free market zones which feel so terrifyingly brutal, and then the areas like the WGA, which is still a closed shop union and consequently has a lot of power, and was able to strike a good deal.
We have just another few moments if there's anyone that has a burning desire to ask a question on any of the last moments. Right, good, okay. I knew I could rely on you. Right, done, we'll start with you.
Very simple question. What's next? What can we look forward to?
Nothing. I'm sort of swanning around Europe, I would say. Swanning around Europe, sort of talking to friends like Bridie, and going to a few TV festivals, and enjoying a bit of downtime, because it was like the most creatively enjoyable thing I've ever done in my life, but also the pressure to make it good we put on ourselves was high, and the pressure particularly to give a satisfying ending, because we all know that TV shows, if they don't have a good ending, it has a sort of outsized effect in your sense of affection for them. So I found it very scary trying to finish the show and make sure that it was right. So I'm relaxing now.
Thank you. When building your team within the writers' rooms, generally we go for those that are like-minded or those that we're familiar with, but by the same token, as you said yourself, it's nice to have different people with different perspectives, especially with the different characters. So how do you go about finding the right people, especially those that are not necessarily on your radar and those that don't want to go crazy on the TikTok and social media? Thank you.
What I would do is just read. There was a small group of people who I already knew from British TV, George Pritchett, Tony Roach, John Brown, who'd all worked on The Thick of It, British political satire, and they also mainly worked on Veep, which I didn't work on very much, a tiny little bit. So I had a little group who I was really comfortable with, which is quite nice in a room. You know, you need to have that because it's a sort of quasi-social, professional thing where you're trying to encourage an atmosphere of creativity and relaxation, and so concentrated relaxation. So it's good to have them. And then there was people whose work I admired but didn't know, like Lucy Prebble, who wrote the play Enron, and just had a revival of The Effect on at the National, and a couple of other playwrights. And I found playwrights to be a great recruiting ground. It's sad for theatre because I think TV often sucks writers out, you know, who could have interesting careers in theatre. But for TV it's good, and for me it was great. And TV has a quality sometimes which anyone who's a writer for TV here should be aware, and I beware myself. It can be quite a grind, you do the notes, you know, the executives tell you to do this, and there's great temptation to do it or do something similar, and theatre has a different quality of a relationship to the writer, and it's a very good breeding ground, I think, for a certain kind of taking of one's work seriously in the best sense of that. So there's a number of playwrights, and then I just read a load of scripts, and so there's no TikTok audition sent for the room, but I did read a lot of scripts that people sent me, some from HBO, some from agents, and I would typically just be looking for one arresting bit that felt like, wow, I've never seen that put like that before, I've never seen that done like that before. And in a way, you know, I could never tell whether someone was going to be amazing at structure or characterization or jokes or business. But as long as you had that thing, then that was one of the key reasons for inviting them into the room.
You mentioned Bear earlier, and I'm curious, what are you watching, what are you reading, and what are you listening to?
Watching almost entirely couples therapy. Is that show available? It's like it's a real sessions of couples therapy filmed, and it's pretty fascinating. It's like in treatment, but real, but couples as well. So you get to do a fun thing where you judge in these relationships who you think is right and who's wrong. What the therapist must never say, but you're constantly changing your mind about who's at fault in the relationship. It's a great show. I've been enjoying the adaptations of the Isabel Ferranti, you know, My Brilliant Friend. That's a great show as well. Reading, I've just started reading Robert Graves's Goodbye to All, that famous book about the First World War in the UK. And it's one of those books that I've always seen, and for some reason thought of it in a certain way, and then as soon as I started reading it, realised it was something very other than what I expected. So I've been really enjoying that. And then I'm going to read Zadie Smith's new novel, and listening to, I'm afraid it's a little bit like the same stuff I've been listening to since 1995, like Here Comes New Order again on the playlist, I'm afraid. So get a tiny bit of new music, but yeah, that I'm a bit of reluctant to move on from my comfort blanket. And when I was writing the show, I listened to all Baroque music. Like I would listen to music while I was working, but never anything with lyrics. And so that was all like Handel and Vivaldi and sort of things that felt grand and slightly corrupt and crumbly, and that helped.
Thank you for your work and for being here and sharing in the way you have. As at least 2 Australians in the room, I would just like to say thank you for highlighting the evil empire and the link to the politics of it. I don't know if you're researchers or you know, but there is a Royal Commission looking into media ownership in Australia now, a political process that's looking at the concentration of media ownership. And the campaigns around that are being led by former prime ministers who said, I couldn't say this when I was in power.
Yes.
But people, you really need to know this is how democracy is undermined.
Yes.
And they're from both sides of politics, because in Australia it's a two-sided politics game, majority. But it's I share that because it sounds like you know, life and art imitating themselves, each other, and the intersection it's so powerful, I think, for the moment that we live in right now of what is media and how do we access information, and who's behind it. And with great due respect to all fantastic journalists who might be in the room, you know, to keep a human side to obviously, you know, daily devastating news items is also a fascinating thing to have thought about in the context of how the people behind news telling and news ownership is really fun. And after a very heavy day at work, I would love to go home and watch this program. It's either, you know, travel cooking shows or Succession. I just say the emotional and intellectual engagement with the show has just been a joy, and thank you.
No, it's very kind of you say, and I take that as a true compliment, because that's what you want to go home and have something that's as fun to watch as a cooking or some grand design show. So I think, and in the Australia context, I was aware of that, and it's fascinating, and it is also fascinating, isn't it, how often it happens in the UK as well, that once the politician is out of power, they talk about the extraordinary influence and pressure they had from the press, and you know, would that they were able to address it while they were in power.
Mr. Murdoch himself.
Yeah, for direct, and also, you know, it's I think of it in the Anglo-American and Australian context, but you know, Mediaset and Meloni and their relationship to Meloni and obviously Berlusconi and Vincent Bolloré and Eric Zemmour, you know, the media concentration and the effect of right-wing media owners is not solely an Anglo-American issue. It's a worldwide one, yeah.
I just have a really quick question. You mentioned a sort of period when you were just starting out, you finished in politics, and then before you got into film writing, you mentioned the importance of agents. And I was just wondering if you had maybe, I imagine there was a period where you were writing a lot, but maybe not getting any traction, or so do you have any tips for young writers trying to get into media?
When you were saying it was, you know, that period when I wasn't doing so well, I thought you were going to ask if I wanted to come and do some painting and decorating for you. Which I think I could theoretically be available for Bridie if I could stay for a couple more days, and it's a nice easy job. Good on walls, not so good on woodwork. I think Bridie you were asking a bit about this, about like, would it be good to think about something for people to take away with them, and at first I'm resistant to that sort of question. I thought I don't have an answer to that, but there is, I think, a sort of cheesy kind of version of follow your heart is really true, in that I think that anything that I ever got that picked up traction was because I'd managed to I'd written something that was really what I wanted to write. And you know, there can be a temptation to see what's doing well in the market of TV and film on Netflix or in the movies or wherever, and think maybe I could imagine writing something a bit like that. But it doesn't have to be dragged from the deepest part of your soul. And I was a comedy writer, so when I was trying to write, what I wanted to write was just really funny stuff that were jokes that I thought would be good, that I hadn't seen that much of. But you can also be dragging. Lucy Prebble, who I work with in the room a lot, calls it painting in red. You know, in a script, you would look at something and say, maybe this needs to be a bit more red, a little bit more drawn from the deeper part of yourself, letting that stuff go onto the page. And so if you can paint in red a little bit and give a little bit of yourself, or come up with that thing that is the thing that only you know about, and that could be in the world, or it might be emotionally or intellectually. If you can do that thing, that will be the thing which, you know, when someone like me or an agent reads it, you know, for whatever the other deficiencies or qualities in the piece, they'll go, oh wow, I've never seen that before, we should talk to this person. Or so it's tough, because then when you're facing the blank sheet of paper, you often have that feeling of like, what do I think about anything? Like, what is the special thing about me? You know, it's quite a tough piece of advice, but it is in there. Probably, if you want to write, there probably is something that you can only you can access. So if you drive towards that, I think that's the best piece of slightly keep it real, cheesy advice. Keep it real, man.
Yes, I just had a question on artificial intelligence because you mentioned that. I'm a journalist myself, and artificial intelligence is coming quite thick and fast, and obviously, you know, it's having a big influence on all these strikes in terms of the writers' strikes, etc., etc. What's your opinion on that? Because a lot of the big tech companies, they're selling it as something that is going to be beneficial to journalists, for example, or writers. You know, they can use it as like something that will add to their ability to write. As a celebrated screenwriter, let's say, what's your opinion on that? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it as bad as it sounds? Or tell me.
AI, good or bad, Bridie? I think this is going to be next week's session, isn't it? You're going to. I don't know enough about it. I guess all I can say.
How do you feel about it?
How do I feel about it? I feel scared for the world. Like I don't know how it's going to work and how many.
You can ever be replaced as a writer?
Yeah, probably eventually, right? I mean, that's one of the things, we just don't know what the capabilities will be, and they're like exponential, and so, all the things that seemed impossible suddenly become possible very fast. So I like to think, I'm uniquely creative, but maybe not. Maybe if it's scraped enough of the stuff that I've scraped, it will come up with new things. I think the only thing that I would find consoling and that I would fight, is part of the AI deal for the WGA, and would be of interest to your readers, right? I think labels, right? If maybe somebody could come up with maybe an AI could come up with a really interesting TV show, but if it's labelled, written by an AI, I think maybe there could be some shows that would work, and you'd tune into a certain kind of show that was very cleverly constructed by an AI, but I think you would tend to be interested in the human creator and the values.
Because surely there's never going to be that original thought if it's based on a certain model, AI, then it can't write what you thought from your head that's very original.
Not today, but I don't know, maybe tomorrow. I just don't know what the capabilities will be. So I wouldn't say that it could never have the sophistication, because I just don't know. Maybe not, and maybe not 5 years, maybe not 20 years, but anyway. So I just think the labels are maybe more useful than convincing ourselves that it will never be able to do what we can do, because it might be able to do what we can do, but I don't think people will be as interested in the thoughts of an AI as they might be in the thoughts of someone who they can relate to.
Hang on, let me just find out what my next script is. Hold on. So, on that note, that's such a bad joke, don't laugh. Okay, I would like to say thank you very much to Jesse, but one thing, I thought we could try and give him a present back before we all end up. So, are there things that you think he should be writing about or doing in his next, in his next piece of work? Just, shout it out, but one at a time, please.
Brussels. Has there ever been a good Brussels show?
Yes.
It's already been done. Trump, oh my God.
Anything else you want apart from Brussels and Trump?
Boris Johnson.
That's actually a mix of the two, actually. It's like a hybrid.
The immunity of the Vatican. Belgian resistance in the Second World War.
See, I'm caught, but the ones that I don't want to write, I'm like, yeah, right, you do the Trump show. And the ones that are interesting, I'm like, well, yeah, that sounds good, but maybe she's going to sue me if I would go away and write the Belgian.
Well, anyway, right, now moving on. Okay, thank you very much, Jesse. Right, next, I'm gonna. Before you all leave, a couple of other things coming up. So we have some very stellar award-winning musicians who will be playing some great, lovely adaptations of the Four Seasons on Thursday, the 19th of October, with Philippa Nuttall, who will be talking about no seasons. So that is a big kind of a climate conversation with musical, in musical setting. On the 9th of November, we've got cultural studies Professor Kirsty Sedgman, who's talking about how to be unreasonable and looking at our value systems and how they compete for each other and how do we actually advance in our societies with different points of view. Psychosis of Whiteness with Kahinda Andrews on the 16th of November. So there's a lot of other stuff coming up. So take one of these. If you're not a member, you should be. And if you're not going to become a member, then persuade someone else to join and then we'll let you off the hook. Okay, so we see you again very soon and thank you very much for coming. And Jesse.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for riding.